In this video, I will show you how to use managed code to add a legend to a data-connected diagram in Visio 2010. In Microsoft Visio 2010, adding a data graphic legend is pretty easy through the UI. To do this with managed code, however, I'm going to have to do a little bit more. First, I'm going to change the diagram services property for the Visio document. This is important if I want to do something with the legend after it's been added. Next, I need to open a built-in Visio stencil that includes the master shapes for the legend. I can then drop the shapes. Then, after I've added the legend, I'm going to move the legend elsewhere on my drawing. So I'll start with a blank Visio 2010 add-in solution in Visual Studio 2010. I'm going to add my code to the This Add-in Startup subroutine stub that Visual Studio provides for me. I'll begin by declaring my variables. I have three: one for my Visio document, one for the page with data graphics, and another for the legend stencil. Now I'll add some code to open the file that I'm using for this demonstration. You can, of course, customize this file path as you need. However, note that I'm using the path.combine method to create the file path string to open. If you wish to use this to open your own file, you will need to add the usingsystem.io directive at the top of your solution. Also, take a look at this file path that I'm using for my document. You see that I'm using the environment.getFolderPath method to get the path of the My Documents folder from the environment of my system. Again, you can customize this as you want. Now I need to make sure that the correct diagram services are enabled to allow me to drop the legend. Visio 2010 introduces a couple of new diagram behaviors, which you can take advantage of in your solution. One of these behaviors is the structured diagram behavior that defines when container membership relationships are created. At a basic level, a data graphic legend is a container. Thus, the document object in Visio 2010 includes a diagram services enabled property that can be set to enable the services that aggregate the new diagram behaviors. Although I don't need to change the value of the diagram services property in order to add a legend to my drawing, I do need to have them set to a value that allows structured diagram behavior if I want to move the legend. So I'll add some code to set the diagram services property to use the new behaviors. I've set the property to VisService version 14.0 in order to enable all the diagram services that exist in Visio 2010. You see that I've converted the enumeration to an integer to set the property. By default, a document created in Visio 2010 is set to VisService none, which means that you cannot make use of these behaviors without explicitly changing the diagram services enabled property. Furthermore, if you're going to change the diagram services enabled value, it is a best practice to record the initial value before you change it, and then return the value to its initial setting after the rest of your code has run. Next, I need to open the built-in Visio stencil that contains the legend. Here, I'll add that code to the sample. You'll notice that I've used the application.getBuiltinStencil file method to get the name of the legend stencil from the built-in stencil files. I've assigned it to a string that I've called VisLegendStencilName. In this next line, I'm using the documents.openX method to open this file. I also want to open the file as a hidden document so that the user is unaware that another document is being opened. The openX method has two parameters, the file name as a string and a flag as a short. The second parameter of the method expects one of the constants from the visopenSaveArgs enumeration, which specifies how the file is opened. I've passed in the file name of the Visio stencil and the visopenHidden constant. Of course, I'm going to want my code to close this stencil once I'm done with it. But before I add that code, let's take a look at the stencil to see what it looks like. I'm going to run just this code, and then switch to Visio. You see that Visio has opened the built-in stencil called legendu.vss. Looking at the stencil, we see that it has 5 master shapes. We're going to use the outer list and field container shapes from this stencil to create the legend. Finally, I can add the code to drop the legend onto my Visio page. So here it is. I've assigned my legend to the VisLegend object that I've declared and initialized when I drop the legend. The legend shape is returned by using the page.dropLegend method, which is new for Visio 2010. The dropLegend method has 3 required parameters: the outer list parameter, which corresponds to the outermost list shape of the legend, the inner container parameter, which corresponds to the inner field container shape used within the legend for each data graphic field, and the populate flags parameter. I've passed in 2 master shapes as arguments for the outer list and inner list parameters, which I retrieved using the masters.getItemU method. I want the legend to be populated when it is added to the page, so I've also passed in the VisLegend populate constant of the VisLegend flags enumeration for the populate flags parameter. Now that I've added the legend shape to the page and I'm done with the Visio legend stencil, I'll add the code to close that document. Remember, Visio considers a stencil to be a document. Next, I'll move the legend to another position on the drawing. So remember that a legend is a container shape that holds other shapes. And since I currently have all the diagram services for Visio 2010 enabled, I can manipulate the entire legend as a single shape. Here's some simple code to move the legend to the bottom left corner of the drawing. First, I'm going to use the ActiveWindow.select method to select the legend. Then I use the selection.move method to move the legend 7 3/4 inches to the left and 6 1/2 inches toward the bottom of the drawing. Finally, I'll reset the document.diagramServicesEnabled property to its original setting. Now I can check the solution to see if it works. So I'll click Start Debugging in Visual Studio, wait as Visio 2010 opens my demo file, and then watch as the legend is added to the bottom left corner of the diagram. Take a look at the legend. You can see the outer list shape here. Also notice that Visio has added a field container shape for each data graphic icon in the diagram. You can find the code sample used in this video in the accompanying article. You may also want to review the reference articles for the document.diagramServicesEnabled property, the documents.openX method, or the page.dropLegend method.